Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here, and welcome to another video. Now this is something I have never filmed before or put out before, and honestly I'd never done this because I just didn't really think I was qualified to do this, but I had a couple people ask me for this, and so I thought I could do it. So basically, here is a list of recommendations for new readers. I put together a pretty basic list of books that are really easy to get into, are really interesting, they don't take too much brain power, and are just really fun reads for newer readers. A little disclaimer before the video starts that I've made this list, as I just said, for new readers. So if you've been reading for a while, or if you have been chronically on BookTok, Bookstagram, BookTube, you would have heard of these books. You most likely would have read these books. This is for people who are wanting to get into reading more, or who has re-sparked that reading love that they used to have in childhood again. And so these are just really basic recommendations for new readers. I thought that was something I could do. A lot recently I haven't really challenged myself in reading new things. I've just kind of stuck to stuff that I know I'll like, so I can't really recommend anything more complex than what I read myself. But based off these, I feel like these are really good to begin with. They're really good for new readers. So anyway, I've broken this down into different genres, and within each genre I have given 2 standalone recommendations. Now I chose to do standalone because for newer readers it is intimidating to commit yourself to a series, so I thought I would just do standalone books. And if you want another recommendation video for newer readers but for series, I will happily do that. Okay, so the first genre that I will be talking about, I have also split into 2 sub genres. I have 2 recommendations for heterosexual romances, and then I have 2 recommendations for queer romances. And again, these are all very easy to read and get into, and they are books that just kind of so easily pull you in that if you're not a big reader, it's a really good feeling. So the first book that I recommend would be Love in Other Words by Christina Lauren. So Christina Lauren is actually 2 authors, Christina and Lauren. That's their author name. They write books together. They have a lot of books that they have written, and most of them are standalone, so you don't have to commit yourself to reading all of their works. They are standalone, mostly romances. Love in Other Words though, when I read it, I think I gave it 5 stars. Like, I absolutely loved it. It has some of my favorite tropes in it, which would be a second chance romance, childhood friends to lovers. It's got flashbacks between past and present, and so you get to see these characters both as adults and how they live their life now, and then flashback to how they were when they were younger and when they first met, and just how they grew up together. And I really like that. It's like one of my favorite things within romance books is that past, present, second chance romance, childhood lovers. Like, there have been many books I've read that have this type of like style and tropes and what's the other word? Anyway, and like plot lines like this. Like, I absolutely love it. So I would really highly recommend it. And it's just such a really cute concept within that, to do with the title. Like, I'm not want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it, but basically with Love in Other Words, you are following Macy and Elliot. They met as children, as I said before, and they became really close. They were childhood best friends, and then obviously something happened to make them stop talking. And then you see Macy later in her life planning a wedding and just getting her career and everything, when she runs back into Elliot, and kind of everything, just all like the memories flood back to her, and she has to kind of deal with having Elliot back in her life and just kind of figuring out what she really wants from that, and then also reminiscing on the past with Elliot, but also trying to figure out what she wants, and because she has a fiance, she's engaged. And so it's a super complicated complicated situation, but it's just really interesting to read. I'd really highly recommend it. I don't know if I'm doing the book justice with my description of it, but I absolutely highly recommend it. It was such a good read. It's really easy to get into. You are so easily able to connect with the characters and really see who they are and their journey. The next book I recommend is The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. Now, I read this one I think at the end of last year or the beginning of this year, and I absolutely loved it. Again, it was another 5-star read for me. And this one, while being a romance book, also has an element of fantasy or like time travel type. So basically you're following Clementine, and she is grieving the death of her aunt, who she absolutely adored and looked up to and spent a lot of her time with. And her aunt has left her apartment, and so she's moved into this apartment, and as she's moving in, she's just kind of reminiscing on the time she spent with her aunt. She goes down to get more stuff. When she comes back up, the apartment is set up as her aunt had it 7 years ago, and she discovers someone to be in the apartment, and like it really freaks her out. But then she realizes that this person in the apartment is from 7 years ago, and she somehow has fallen into a time slip within the apartment. And so you go through this story of them being in the apartment, getting to know each other, and then you're curious about whether she has seen him in her present timeline and he like where he is. But then you're also dealing with grief and loss and just kind of how she deals with that and goes through life, and just it's a very interesting story. I absolutely love it. I do like stories that have that sort of like time slip aspect to it. So like with movies, I would say like kind of, but not really, like The Age of Adeline, where there's a time thing, The Time Traveler's Wife. It's really kind of, if you've watched The Lake House with Sandra Bullock, it's kind of like that, so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. But I would absolutely recommend this book. It's so well written, and I was so deeply invested into this book. I finished it really quickly, and even my mum loved it. I gave it to my mum and she absolutely loved this book, so I really recommend this one. So now moving on to my queer romance recommendations, and I do have to preference, when I say queer, I do mean this in the most basic term possible. And I think within these books there isn't too much explored with a variety of queerness. It is more of a basic type. So we have one recommendation that is 2 males and then one recommendation that is 2 females. And so that's what I mean when I say really basic. There are lots of books that I haven't read yet that follow a lot more variety of queerness within these stories, but these ones are really good introductory into queer romance reading, and I really enjoyed them. They really helped me on my own journey, and they just have a special place in my heart. Both of these recommendations are written by the same author, which is Casey McQuiston, and you probably would have heard at least of one of these as it was turned into a movie. And so that first one is Red, White and Royal Blue. So this one follows 2 males, one from the US and one from England or the UK. So the US, you follow the president's son, and in this book we have like, I think it's the first female president, which is really cool as well to have included in this book. But you follow her son, and then you follow the Prince of England, I believe. And it's not really an enemies to lovers fully, because I'm the type of person to believe like a proper enemies to lovers is like in a fantasy novel where they're literally about to kill each other, enemies to lovers. But it is technically enemies or hate to lovers, really, and they're kind of forced into a friendship over having a very public argument, and they have to deal with publicity and their image and dealing with queerness within such a public and important role within their own society, and just dealing with the pressures of that, but also wanting to explore these new feelings and this love that they didn't think they would ever explore. And it's just a really interesting book. I really liked it. This book is an open door romance. There is spice to it, and you do read about sexual things within this book, so just that as well, depending on whether you want an open door romance, which is like spicy or like smart and you actually read about what's going on, or you can have a closed door romance where it's more like a fade to black where what they do is implied rather than shown. So just some terminology for you there as well. So far all the books I've recommended have been open door with a variety of spiciness, but I do remember that Red, White and Royal Blue is more on the spicy scale. There is that to think about as well, but I do really recommend it, and it is a really good way in which people with public images have to deal with whether they want to deal with the backlash or the judgment from people knowing about their sexuality and figuring themselves out. And I think it's just a really fun story to read and I really would recommend it. And the next one by Casey McQuiston is One Last Stop, which is two females. This one again also has some sort of like time element, so I think that's really interesting to add within a romance, just so you have your romance but you also have this other element which creates a really fun, interesting story. And so I didn't mean to have two romances that have this kind of like time element to it, but I really do like them. So in this you follow a young adult August as she moves to New York City to kind of like escape the antics her mother's up to. Like she's just kind of over it, so she moves to New York City to kind of start her own life. And when she finds this job and it's really cool, she starts to make friends from her apartment, and then when she catches the subway one day she notices this girl and they start having a conversation, and she's really cool and she sees this girl on the train almost every single morning. But after a while she realizes that she's always in the same clothing and she kind of doesn't realize what time it is. She discovers that this girl is stuck on the subway, and she has for about like 30 years. So that's all explained within like the first little bit or the like blurb on the back. So you follow August trying to figure out who this girl is, how she got stuck, and trying to figure out a way to get her unstuck while also exploring her feelings for this girl and like fully exploring her own like sexuality and queerness, and kind of discovering that it's a really good self-exploration book, as well as having that extra cool element of like this like time mystery and figuring out what happened. And I think it's just a really interesting read. Again, both of these books also are really easy to get into, and because of the extra aspects on top of just the romance, it's really, really interesting. Those are the romance books that I recommend, and I hope people who are new to reading aren't intimidated at all to try these books. I really, really recommend them, and I think they're super interesting reads to like start off with and just kind of find your groove within the romance genre. So the next genre I'm going to recommend some books for new readers would be fantasy. Now, finding standalone fantasies that I have read so I can actually recommend them, it was really hard. I have one standalone recommendation and then I have a duology. This duology is really easy to read and there's only 2 books, so I didn't think it would be that bad to put in this recommendation. I tried so hard to find really good beginner friendly fantasy standalones. I just haven't read that many, so I couldn't honestly recommend them without reading them. So the first one I recommend is To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. Now, I read this back in 2020, so it's been a hot minute since I've actually read this book, but 2020 was when I was fully getting back into my reading, and so this is one of the standalone fantasy books that I read, and I remember really enjoying it and liking that it was a standalone, so I didn't really have to commit myself to too much, because committing to a fantasy series can be a lot. Like, fantasy can be really intimidating for some people. Some fantasy books still intimidate me now. Like, I would say I'm still towards a base level reader for fantasy. I'm trying to challenge myself more with fantasy books. So To Kill a Kingdom is, I would say, like a more dark and twisty, not retelling, but reimagining of The Little Mermaid, which is what intrigued me to read it at first, because I loved The Little Mermaid growing up. Like, it was one of my favorite Disney movies. And so this one, they are sirens and they collect prince's hearts. There is obviously an evil witch that curses your main character and turns her human in order for her to get the heart of a prince. The siren has lost her siren ability, her siren song, and so she has to try and lure the prince to collect his heart without her siren song. But also within that, this prince is a siren hunter, so it's part of his job to go and hunt sirens. And so you've got a siren and a siren hunter, and it does turn into a romance as well, so it's technically like a romantasy, and this is what I would more consider like an enemies to lovers. Like you literally have a siren and a siren hunter, so enemies to lovers. I don't remember if this is an open or a closed door romance. If it is open door, I think it's like an ajar open, not a full open. And it's not too long of a book. I think it's only around the 3 to 350 page mark. Like it's not too big, it's a standalone book, and you can kind of understand and follow the concept if you are familiar with The Little Mermaid. Just trade mermaids for sirens and then make the prince a siren hunter, and that's pretty much what you get. A really easy concept to follow, and I would recommend it. So the next fantasy books I recommend is a duology, and that is the Letters of Enchantment duology, which is Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. Now this was really popular when Divine Rivals came out, I believe last year or the year before, and then Ruthless Vows definitely came out last year. They got really popular. They're both pretty short books. I think they're both around that 3 to 350 page mark, so they're not big at all, and they're really easy to get into, really easy to read. And basically you follow two rival journalists competing for the same spot in their company, and they volunteered to go do some journaling and report back on what is going on within the war. So you kind of get vibes of like a bit of like World War One, World War Two vibes of the war happening and how they're living within that, but make it fantasy. So you've got like the gods, and the gods are controlling this and making the wars and fighting, so vibes of World War Two but with magical gods. So they go in and they are just kind of there to report on what's happening within the war. But then on top of that, you have the main female character, and she is writing letters to her brother, and she puts them under her wardrobe and then they disappear, and then she gets a reply back. And so she doesn't know who she's talking to, but it ends up that who she's talking to is her rival journalist. And this is really quickly explained within the first like couple chapters of the book, so it's not really spoiling anything. I would never try and spoil a book, but it just creates a really interesting concept of her talking with this other person, not knowing who it is, and kind of getting interested in this other person, not knowing that it's her rival journalist, but the rival journalist knowing that it's her. And it's just a really interesting concept. So then you have what's going on, you have the fantasy and you have the war, but you also have the romance within that, and it creates a really interesting like dynamic and plot line. Now moving on to the next genre, and that is thriller novels. I have only more recently, within like the last year or so, gotten into thriller novels, but the ones I have read have been really interesting and I really enjoyed them. And so I have two pretty good recommendations. And so the first one is The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. Now this thriller is a mix between like a more normal human thriller with a little bit of supernatural sprinkled in there. It's not too supernatural, it's not too like scary, but you have a little bit of like supernatural mystery in there, so it's a mix, and I really enjoyed it. I remember like just picking this up and like not being able to put it down. Like I would read 150 pages like at a time of reading this, and I'm not usually a person to like binge read a lot. Like unless I'm really invested in a book, I don't usually binge read. I will read like a chapter here or two every now and again, or I'll mostly listen to a book, but I like physically binge read this book. It was really cool, and I've heard a lot of good things about Riley Sager books. This is the only one I have read, but I have a few of his other books that I'm really excited to get to eventually. She's a famous theatre actor, and her husband had passed away at this lake, and she kind of goes through a bit of a mental breakdown through this. She becomes an alcoholic, and she just makes a fool of herself on stage, and she gets some really bad publicity. So her mother sends her back to the lake where her husband died to just kind of isolate and kind of get herself and her shit together. And then she gets really invested in this couple that move into the house across the lake, and she just gets so invested into this couple. She ends up becoming friends with them, and then when the wife goes missing, she is trying to figure out and work out the case of what has happened to the wife. And like a lot of stuff happens. It's really, really interesting the way it's written. I think I remember reading towards the end of the book where like I was reading it at night and I was a little bit scared. Like I was like, I need to know what happens, but I was like, I don't know. I was like, my heart was beating so fast while reading it because I was just like so nervous. I don't think I was like a little bit scared, but it wasn't like horror level scary. Not that I've actually read a horror book. It's not scary, but it's like suspenseful and creepy. That's kind of the vibe. But the writing was really easy to get into and figure out, and just the way it was written, you could really imagine and see what was going on. Like the imagery was just amazing, and I genuinely would really, really recommend it. Now the next one, I know some people who have been reading for a while, if they're still watching the video at this point, would roll their eyes at me for recommending this book. Mainly for the author. This author has been a bit controversial, but this is a book for new readers, and this was the first like thriller book I really read, and I absolutely devoured it. I loved it. Like one of my friends read it in one night, and she is not a big reader, and so I just think it's a really good book for new readers, and that is Verity by Colleen Hoover. I tried not really to include Colleen Hoover in this video. I have definitely read a lot of Colleen Hoover, and she was really big for me within my early reading journey, and I can fully understand why. Like her books are pretty good. I just have heard a lot of things, especially with the movie coming out of It Ends With Us and just the controversy with that. I didn't really want to recommend anything by her, but within thrillers, this is a really, really good beginner friendly thriller book, and this is definitely like more human, not paranormal, supernatural. And basically you have a really famous writer has gotten into an accident where she can't finish a series that she was contracted to. She wrote the first 3 or 4 books, and there's another 3 books that need to be written. So they bring in this ghostwriter to finish the books, and this ghostwriter is brought into the home of this author and into her office to try and like look at the notes that the author had and of where the story was going. And throughout this, because she's living at the house, she's living with the author who's injured, she's living with the husband and their child. And so you have a really interesting concept of this like injured author, this ghostwriter, and then also there's a bit of a tensiony romance between the ghostwriter and the husband, and it's just a lot going on. And again, there was like parts I was reading this and I was like, oh my god, and I don't know why I read it at night. Like it freaked me out. It was just such a really good book, and I will say Colleen Hoover's writing is really, really easy to get into. It's super easy to understand, especially for people who haven't read a lot throughout their childhood or not recently. So it's really easy to get back into. It doesn't take a lot. But yeah, I don't know, this book, there's also some stuff in there that you're like, what the actual frick is going on, and you're like, how could you actually write this? But it's in that way that it's really, really good. So those are my thriller recommendations, and so that are all my recommendations for today. I thought I would keep it pretty basic, pretty simple, and not too many overwhelming options. And just a little recap of all the books I've mentioned in this video. We have Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren, The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston, Red, White and Royal Blue, and then One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. Then we have To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. Then the Letters of Enchantment duology, which is Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. Then we have The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager and Verity by Colleen Hoover. Now, all these books are also classed in the adult section. I haven't gone through any YA books. I could do a whole nother video of beginner, newer, reader friendly YA books as well, but these are all just the adult genre books that I would recommend for newer readers. And yeah, I hope you liked today's video. I hope the recommendations were good for you, and I'm sorry if my explanations of the books are actually terrible. And just a disclaimer again, like I said at the beginning of the video, these are very basic recommendations for newer readers, for people who are just getting into reading. They are really not for anyone who's been reading for a while, who is really immersed in the book community, because they are very popular and a lot of people have read these books already. But there's literally a reason for that, of why they're so popular, because they're so easy to get into and they're really good books. So yeah, that is today's video. I hope you liked it. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.